Welcome to the show, Gary. Introduce yourself to everybody.
My name is Gary Quesenberry. I'm a retired Federal Air Marshal and now author here living in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia.
Very cool. That's a beautiful area up there. Um, what kind of led you in your early life to want to start a career in law enforcement? Because I know you've done a ton of different things, and Air Marshal is just a part of it. But
Right.
what got you started in law enforcement?
Well, when I was 17, I grew up here. I was just talking about living in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. So this is where I grew up, Carroll County, Virginia. And at 17 years old, it didn't hold a lot of promise. So I decided I was going to leave, like most kids my age from poor communities. I joined the military. So I went into the Army at 17 years old. Dad had to sign the papers for me. I did a little over 3 years there, Desert Storm veteran. I got out and I kind of lost my way a little bit, like a lot of kids do that at age, that
Sure.
big transition coming out of the military into civilian life, not exactly knowing what to do. So I kind of stumbled around for a couple of years, just doing odd jobs and working in factories, which is pretty much the only thing you can do in this area. And a good friend of mine that I grew up with, his dad kept telling us that we needed to get a job, a federal job, because, good benefits, stability, all that stuff. And they were opening up a federal prison in Beckley, West Virginia. And that's where my friend lived. And he kept telling me, man, you come up here, you stay with us, we'll get a job here and then we can move your family up. Because at the time, I just got married. My son was uh, just 1 year old. And I'm like, okay, I've got to do something. I've got people, that I'm responsible for here. I've got people depending on me. I got to get a job. So I go into the Federal Bureau of Prisons and I worked in Beckley for about 5 years. I got promoted to lieutenant and went out to USP Penitentiary in Atwater, California, which is where my wife is from, California. So it put us closer to her home. I worked there for about a year and then 9/11 hit. And when 9/11 hit, in the prison system, I was part of what's called the Special Operations Response Team. It's like a internal hostage rescue unit, inside the prison.
Mhm.
Uh, so I always enjoyed that type of work. And it was much different than just the standard prison work, turning keys. And once 9/11 hit, they started ramping up very, very quickly. And they were seeking people that had military law enforcement experience, people that already had a little bit of federal, experience and stuff like that. So I fit that bill. And I was looking to do something different. I wanted, like most people after 9/11, you're looking to serve again. A lot of people went back in the military, and I decided I wanted to go the Air Marshal route because at the time, 9/11, there were only 33 active Air Marshals and they were primarily used for international missions. So, me with thousands of other people applied for that job and I was lucky enough to get picked up and started right there in 9/11. So that's how that whole, Federal Air Marshal law enforcement career got started.
Yeah, that is that's a good story. I mean, I'm sure I could ask you a ton of questions about your time just, working in the prison and that sort of thing. I will ask you this for anybody who's listening who's getting into law enforcement. I have heard people say that they have gone to work in the prison first and then they move into working on the street in law enforcement. How does starting in the prison set you up for working better outside of the prison in law enforcement?
I think it really set me up for success. So, prison jobs get a bit of a bad rap sometimes. And, it's like any other job, any other, law enforcement career. You get out of it what you put into it. And the one thing that I learned working in a prison, is your communication skills are key
Mhm.
because you're surrounded by people there that, spend their entire day thinking of ways to hurt you or to get around you, to do something that they want to get done. And if you go in there just kind of hard as nails trying to hammer these dudes and you don't have a little bit of tact and some communication skills, you're just going to get hurt. You learn a lot of patience. You see just about everything you possibly could see inside the fence. So when you get out, on the street or in the air, as I was, there's very little that shocks you at that point.
Mm. Okay.
So, all the posturing that people do, especially in the aviation domain nowadays and things with, the crazy stuff happening on flights, that just kind of falls by the wayside. You see that for what it is. It's just somebody posturing and trying to make themselves, appear to be tougher than they are. And when it comes down to, actually getting physical with someone, that's something in the prison system you did on a regular basis. So it wasn't something that was new. And if you needed to put your hands on somebody during the course of your job, you were judicious about it because you understood that people can get hurt. And you also understand the importance of, before it comes to that, those communication skills and how de-escalation can work to save your life just as well as, the hands-on stuff.
Yeah, man, that's a great answer. That's awesome. Yeah, it seems like the whole part about, nothing's gonna surprise you once you get out into, outside of the prison. That's a good point to know. So to talk about like the Federal Air Marshal part of it, can you give us an overview of what your job responsibilities were?
Well, as with any law enforcement job, the direction changes a little bit over time. So right after 9/11, the job was in the air. You were an air marshal. It says it right there on your creds, and that's where your job is, 30,000 feet in the air. So at the time, our job was, to detect and deter acts of terrorism in the aviation domain. So, situational awareness was a really big part of that, just kind of understanding that baseline behavior in the aviation domain, how people should be acting, spot anomalies that kind of draw your attention to the possibility that something could be going wrong, and then training yourself as to how to deal with that in terms of, like we just talked about, de-escalation all the way up to confrontation. So, that was our job at the time. And there was a lot of opportunity to get out of the air, if you needed a break. Like a lot of people, they fly, 4 or 5 years, and it starts to take a toll health wise with all the time changes and, the crappy diet eating in motels and fast food and airports. So you can get out of the air by doing things like administrative jobs, working in, the operation center where all the scheduling and everything takes place, or working as I did in training. I worked a little bit in the field office as a trainer, 6 month rotations, get you out of out of the air for a few months. And eventually I moved on to be an instructor at our national academy in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and did that for a few years. So, the job is to protect, civilians in the aviation domain to stop another event like 9/11. That's the job. But
Right.
there are opportunities in that job to do other things. So it's not all of that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, you make a great point about how it takes a toll on your body with all the different time zones and never knowing where you're going to be and all that. I can't. That's a part of that job that I had not considered before. So yeah, I bet that does wear on you after a while.
And you don't really understand how much of a, number it does on your body until, like, I retired in 2020. And it took me a good year or so to get my sleep pattern, back to where it needed to be, and to kind of regulate my diet and my exercise routines, because you didn't always have time for that. It was like,
Mm,
a quick, body weight workout in the hotel room before you got to catch a flight, going to Amsterdam, or, it was just all this crazy stuff all the time. So it was really hard to maintain a schedule. And now that I'm retired, I see that, even in my 50s now, I'm in better shape than I was in my 40s when I was flying. So, it does take a toll, and you try to stay in as good a shape as you possibly can when you're doing that job, because the public is depending on you to be able to handle things in the air should it come to that. So you don't want to let yourself go, but it's difficult, and it does take a toll on the guys out there doing the job, guys and girls out there doing the job.
Earlier in your response, you talked about baselines and anomalies and using situational awareness. Is
Yeah.
there a story that you can share with us about how you use those skills to spot something before things went sideways?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of them. My personal life as a Federal Air Marshal, but I think the situational awareness piece really uh, came home to roost with me when I was working in the prison system. So, I
Okay.
had a lot of really good. I was lucky enough to have a lot of really good mentors there, and they taught me that if something's about to go wrong, you're not necessarily looking for it as much as you are feeling it.
Mm,
And it kind of speaks to that intuition piece that I talk about in my books, and how that should always be listened to. We're the only animals in the world that will look danger straight in the face and try to rationalize its presence, as opposed to just getting away from it. So I learned very quickly in the prison system that when something feels wrong, it usually is. So that's when you need to start taking a closer look at things. When I worked there, I was never a hard ass or anything, with guys. I wasn't trying to, make people upset or anger them. They're there as punishment. They're not there to be punished by me. I'm just there to do a job.
right.
So, I, I try to talk to guys and get to know them and stuff like that. But in the course of just doing your job in the prison system, you're going to upset some people, and you're going to get threats and stuff like that. So there was one kid who actually had family that lived there in Beckley, West Virginia, who would threaten me because I did something. I took something he wasn't supposed to have or whatever, and it upset him. he threatened to kill me. Don't ever let me see you or your family out. I've only got, 6 months left and I'll be, out here in the neighborhood. So, when you get threats like that, you take them seriously. You always do. And this guy, when people get out, they look a little bit different than they did when they were behind the fence. You don't see them in the khakis anymore. They generally get a haircut, cleaning themselves up a little bit or something. So one day, my wife and I, we had, 2 kids at the time, and we were in Walmart. And I don't, because that's the only place to shop really in Beckley, West Virginia at the time.
Sure.
But I had, I had my wife and kids with me, and I'd always told them, you know, because anytime there's a prison in a community, you get that prison element outside the fence. Their families come in, their compadres and their gang affiliates and stuff like that ended up moving into the area as well. So you never know who's around. So I tried to, take care of the situational awareness piece with my family, and I always told them that if I ever, if we're ever out and about and I tell you to leave, like to get out, don't ask questions. Don't, try to, figure out what's going on. Just do it, because something's about to go bad. I wouldn't tell you to get away from me and to leave unless something was wrong. So we're in the Walmart, and I see this guy. We make eye contact, and at first it didn't click with me, who this guy was, and because he looks different. And then I made a couple of, surreptitious routes through a couple of the aisles and came up behind the guy. And I realized who it was. It was a guy that had made a threat against my family. And he gets to the end of the aisle and he's looking left and right like he don't know where I went. So he's kind of looking for me. And I told my wife, who was following me with the kids in the shopping cart, I'm like, just go, leave everything, get out in the parking lot, And she didn't ask any questions. So I confronted the guy, like, hey, are you looking for me? And he turned around. He was kind of shocked. I didn't know how this was going to go at that point, but the important fact is that I was situationally aware enough to recognize this guy and understand how to get around him so that I could tell if I was being followed or not. When I realized I got my family out of harm's way and was able to address the situation the way I felt necessary. And as it turns out, the guy was very apologetic. He's like, hey, man, I saw you. I just wanted to apologize, like behind the fence. I've got to save face. I've got to be this tough guy in front of all these people. So I made those threats, and I would never, I wouldn't do that. So, we ended up chatting for a little while, asking, how life was going since he got out and stuff like that. And we went our separate ways. But you never know how a situation like that can go. So it's important, Warren, to practice that situational awareness so that when there's a dangerous or a possibility of a dangerous situation around you or your family. And then 2, knowing how to communicate with people so that you can either de-escalate the situation or, get assistance as you need.
Yeah, man, that's crazy that, I'm glad that you had already set up everything with your family, knowing, "Hey, if I tell you to get out, you get out." And I think that probably led to a lot of your success and how you were able to free up your emotions and your, uh, mental stress at that moment, right?
Well, exactly. And those contingency plans are the most important part, like making sure that your family understands, some of the safety concerns that you have. And, the things that you catch. Your question was, when did I catch something using my
Right.
situation awareness, and how did it work out? Fortunately, that situation worked out well.
Mm,
But there have been instances that I write about in my book, where I let things get past me,
mm,
and it happens. And, it put my family in jeopardy. Someone tried to kidnap my children when we lived in Las Vegas. And, luckily things turned out okay, just through certain, you know, the way things played out, everything turned out okay. But to this day, I don't know who that was or why they did what they did. But at the time, I was a new Federal Air Marshal working out of the Las Vegas field office, and Federal Air Marshals were being targeted at that point.
mhm.
Because, whoever it was that was after us was, understood that we were ramping the system up and they were trying to shut that down. So, it's the things that get past you that catch you by surprise that you really have to be prepared for. That's why that contingency planning is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody wants to try to make a plan in the midst of all of the panic of the moment. It's good to have the time and forethought to kinda get those details ironed out before it happens.
Absolutely. And everybody knows, if you've ever been in the military or law enforcement or anything, a plan is nothing more than a point from which to deviate, because nothing is going to go according to plan. So, but at least you
Right.
have some sense of how things should go so that you have a starting point. And you may have to wing it from, when things go bad to you getting to a point of safety. But without that plan, like you said, it's just chaos. And it's really hard to think and figure things out when that's happening to you.
Yeah, yeah, that's crazy. So talking about your time being a Federal Air Marshal, if you can, just from a to educate civilians, what happens in the air when a passenger becomes unruly? Maybe somebody's having like a mental breakdown, they're intoxicated, something like that. They start threatening people, and everybody in the plane is now worried. Kind of what are the next steps that people can expect to happen so they can kind of be a little bit more aware?
Well, it really depends because you've seen like Instagram and Facebook and on the news and stuff now. The instances of people acting up on aircraft now prior to COVID, was in the hundreds every year. Prosecutable offense was around 100, maybe between 100 and 200 cases.
Mhm.
It's in the thousands now annually. It's happening so much more often. And I don't know what it was about COVID that triggered that, but when people came back to flying, they just act differently. And it puts people in jeopardy. So your reaction to stuff like that is going to vary based on the circumstances. So this is why it's important to practice that situational awareness. So let's say you're in the air or on the ground and somebody on the plane is being disruptive. The first thing that you want to do is just stay in your seat. Don't instigate anything. Make sure that if you're traveling with your family, that you have them in a position where they're safe from if, blows start to fly or anything like that. If you got to switch seats, put your kids next to the skin of the aircraft while you take the aisle, something like that, just be situationally aware. And then let the people that are trained to handle things like that handle it. So, the first thing that's going to happen is people are going to whip out their cell phones and start recording. So if you make yourself a part of it and you become a part of it that isn't being effective and you're just instigating things, then that makes you culpable in how that turns out. So, just sit in your seat, let people that are trained to handle it handle it. Flight attendants are trained to deal with unruly passengers. If it happens on the ground, there's going to be security personnel that are going to show up and get the person removed. So again, don't instigate. Don't try to, throw fuel on the fire. Just let things play out. Keep your family safe. Keep yourself safe. If it's in the air, it's a little bit of a different story because you don't have that backup coming, right? And if the flight attendants can't handle it, sometimes it's upon the passengers or the rest of the crew to get involved. Never step in and just volunteer yourself for that. Flight attendants are trained to reach out to what they call ABPs, able-bodied passengers, in the event that there's a situation that they can't handle themselves. And the flight attendants will know if there are air marshals or other law enforcement personnel on board. They're also trained to pick up on that. So, say off-duty military that are traveling on vacation, law enforcement officers, some law enforcement officers carry armed on the plane, even though they're not federal air marshals, if they're, in the course of their duties, and they're federal agents, trained to do that. So, they'll call upon those people first. And if it gets to the point where they need to start calling on able-bodied passengers and you're able and willing to help, then that's when you step in. Otherwise, your own safety should be your only concern, not, getting this video for Instagram or anything like that. You need to be paying attention to what's going on around you. You need to be paying attention to the people you're traveling with if you're with your family.
Yeah. Yeah. That's crazy because, you talk about how things have ramped up and people's behavior on planes has absolutely shifted since COVID. Um, Kind of tell me, like, what were the more like common problems that people were having, and what is it kind of morphed into today? What is it that you see a lot of on planes that is troublesome?
Well, it's always been just general frustration. People are traveling, they got places they need to be. There's a delay, there's, all these different issues, and it kind of starts wearing on you after a while. You've traveled before, I'm sure, you sit in an
Yeah.
airport with your family and screaming kids for a couple hours. You're ready to get on that plane and get to wherever the hell it is you're going, so you can get a little bit of space. And when it doesn't happen, sometimes people have a tendency to take that out on staff. They take it out on the people around them. It's everybody else's fault. And a lot of, in my own personal experience, a lot of things get, elevated to a level that they don't need to be elevated to simply because the people working in the airport don't know how to do that de-escalation piece that we discussed. So I think communication skills are key even in that job, or any job, really. But I don't know what it was about COVID, but I think it has to do with just staffing, a lack of training. A lot of people lost money. And when you lose money, in the airline industry, you're looking for ways to recover that money. And anytime a budget gets cut or money needs to be saved somewhere, normally the first thing to go is training. So when you lose that and people aren't being trained specifically on how to deal with unruly passengers, they just got to check however many boxes they need checked so that they can get certified to be in the air. You know, those, those critical pieces when it comes to safety kind of get left by the wayside.
Mhm.
And I think that since, people aren't necessarily receiving the level of training they need to in the communication piece, that things escalate a little bit more quickly than they did in the past. And, you think as a passenger that your frustration is, what's most critical in the moment. That's what's most important right now is the fact that I get from here to Wichita or wherever the hell it is I'm going. But, people don't necessarily think about others. There's a level of empathy that kind of helps out a little bit too, because I'll guarantee the flight attendants have had a rough day too. They have to deal with delays and they have to deal with late catering or somebody that didn't show up for their shift or whatever, the same way that we have to deal with things. And when those two things collide, especially 30,000 feet in the air, it can cause problems. So I think that's, part of the escalation piece.
Yeah, yeah. Everything you said there really makes sense, especially, people losing money, people just don't have patience that much anymore to deal with it. So yeah, that's an interesting way that, our behavior has changed, post pandemic. That's an interesting observation.
I think a lot of people just don't, they don't want to be told what to do anymore. I think we got told what to do to a point over a 2 year period that now just the least little bit, of somebody trying to flex a little bit of authority on us causes problems. And so I was a Federal Air Marshal in 2020 when COVID hit, and I just come back from Amsterdam, and my boss reached out to me. Now I knew I was getting ready to retire. I already had the paperwork filed, everything. And my boss told me, hey, said, don't come back in the office for a couple of weeks. You just came back from Amsterdam. There's this virus going around and we need you to stay isolated. I'm like, all right, well, we're looking at a house down in Virginia, so I'll be down there if you need me. Just give me a call. I'll come back up. And I was flying out of the Philadelphia office at the time. And, after I came back, when they, started air travel, started ramping back up a little bit, it was different. Like, they would skip every other aisle on the aircraft. Nobody was sitting in the middle seat, which was nice, but you had to have the masks on, right?
Right.
So at first, everybody was pretty cool about it. But then you start seeing things like the flight attendants standing up in the front with their mask down under their chin, laughing and joking and pouring drinks for everybody or whatever. And then they would put them up and they'd walk down the aisle and start, chastising passengers who didn't have their masks on when you saw them up front 2 seconds ago without their. And so, it was that little bit of, kind of that duality that was kind of pissing people off a little bit. And some people they get a little bit of authority and they want to flex that, and people just have a problem with it. And I think that's carried over, even to today, this far past COVID, people are still struggling with that, that authority thing. They're not going to tell me what to do, and it causes issues in the air.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I think you're right a lot about the flexing of authority and things like that, and people just being fed up with that. We could talk probably another hour about that aspect of human behavior. But what are some safety tips that you can give to me and to the people listening to help keep themselves safe when they fly?
Well, one thing I always try to tell people is don't just assume that because you're on the plane and you went through all these different levels of security that you are safe, because there are so many things that get through security that you have no idea what you're setting on that plane with. I'll give you an example. I was working as an air marshal out of the Vegas field office, and this was probably in 2000, it was before 2007, so around 2006, 2005. And I'm sitting next to this little, elderly lady, up in first class. And we get up to cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign comes off. People are moving around the aircraft, and she reaches underneath the seat in front of her and pulls out this big crocheted bag, and she pulls an apple out that's wrapped in, saran wrap, and she unwraps it, sets it on her tray table. She digs around in her bag and comes out with like an 8-inch kitchen knife, or slicing this apple on the plane, 30,000 feet in the air. And I'm sitting there as a Federal Air Marshal, I'm like, okay, so we didn't train for this. This one was probably 75. She's got an 8-inch kitchen knife sitting right beside me on the airplane. How should I handle this? I'm obviously not going to tackle the lady and pin her against the skin of the aircraft and demand she give me the knife. So I was like, ma'am, I'm like, you're not supposed to have that on the plane, right? She goes, I had it in my bag when I came through security and they didn't take it. So I thought it was okay. And I'm like, trust me, it's not. So I ended up, one of the few times I ever had to identify myself on a flight. I said, listen, I said, here's what we're going to do. I said, I'm going to take that from you. All right. And then once we get on the ground, I'm going to hand it over. They'll give it to security or whatever. She's like, but that's one of my good knives. Well, I'm like, I'll let you work that out with him, but I'm just going to take it from you right now. Okay. And everything worked out. So my point is, just don't assume that you're safe. So a lot of people get on the airplane, they're kind of lost in that digital world. They got their headphones on, they get sucked into the little screen watching movies or whatever. So now you've cut yourself off visually and auditorily from your surroundings. And anytime you do that, if things go south, you're going to be behind the eight ball when it comes to how you react. So just practice a little situational awareness on the flight. Keep an eye out for the things around you, especially in the event you get separated from your family, which happens on flights sometimes. So, then it becomes even more necessary to be very well aware of what's happening, especially if you got, a teenager that gets separated from you by a few rows or whatever. So, you've got a job to do when you're on that plane, in my opinion, my personal opinion, and that's to protect the people that you're with, if you're traveling with your family. If you're by yourself and you feel comfortable shutting yourself down and taking a nap or whatever, then by all means, go ahead. I understand some people have to rest on the flight, but I think that's one thing that most people need to be aware of is the fact that, there is potential for dangerous things to be on that flight, and you need to know what you're looking for and how to react to things like that if you come across them during the course of your travels.
Right. The story about the kitchen knife, that is hilarious, and of course, she was upset that it's one of her good knives
Oh,
that
yeah.
she's gonna
Yeah.
lose.
Yeah, it's a good
Well,
knife.
if it's your good knife, why did you take it out of your house? I mean, come on, lady, that sort of thing. Man. Alright, so, unfortunately, Boeing's kind of been in the news a lot with, mechanical issues and things like that, tons of memes, whatever. How much of that is true, I don't necessarily know. Do you feel like it is safe to fly today?
I do. I do. So, I know, with Boeing, they had the door blow off on one of the flights. And did you see in the news like a second whistleblower just died?
Yeah, yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, it's
MRSA,
interesting.
yeah, MRSA got him, 44-year-old.
Yeah.
So,
Mm,
it's there's a lot going on there, but and we could unpack that all day long. But, in my opinion, it is still safe to fly. You
okay.
know, any company, Boeing has more airplanes in the air than anybody else, right? So there's obviously more of a chance for things to go wrong with them than other aircraft manufacturers because there's
Right,
fewer
just
of
statistically speaking, they're gonna
them.
have the greater.
Exactly, exactly. So the chances of something happen are very, very slim, and there are more recalls and safety issues like that go undetected or unacknowledged in the auto industry than there are in the aviation industry. So, it's risk mitigation. It's what risk you're willing to take on to get to where it is you need to be. But I can still say, I'm no expert on it, but I feel perfectly comfortable flying just as much as I would driving still. So I
Okay.
don't, I don't think there's issues there, granted, but it's not just there. They're everywhere. Those are just the ones that are being highlighted right now.
Right, right. Yeah, and, of course, you see the footage of the door blowing off on that particular flight, and I'll be honest, I was one of these people that always thought that it would just suck everything and everyone out the door with it, so it was kind of, in some ways, peaceful for me to see, "Hey, nobody actually got hurt in this issue, nobody, got pulled out of the plane or anything." So I was like, "Oh, people are just sitting there, it's really windy, of course, that's uncomfortable, but you're gonna survive."
Yeah, your ears are going to pop and it's going to be very uncomfortable for a while.
So, Gary, I'm sure, like, as a Federal Air Marshal, you've gotten the question before, what happens if you discharge a firearm in a plane and you miss and the bullet strikes the skin of the plane? What happens in that situation?
Well, a lot of people have this misconception because of, things they see in Hollywood about what would happen, like getting sucked out of the window or whatever. But in reality, that's not the case. You know, Aircraft are built with so many redundant systems and they're just one big controlled leak in the first place. So as long as the pilot can get the aircraft down to an elevation where the outside air pressure and inside air pressure are stabilized, nobody's going to get sucked out of that plane. There's going to be some unintended consequences people don't realize, like cold air rushing in from outside, hitting a warm cabin. It kind of fogs everything up so that you can't see stuff like that. But it's nothing catastrophic to the point where the entire aircraft is going to go down.
So, Gary, kind of looking at the future, what are your biggest concerns about air travel moving forward?
Right now, I think my biggest concern is just the people that are flying and that kind of escalation of violence on the aircraft. I'm fortunate enough now in retirement, I get to be a situational awareness expert on the show I Crime with Elizabeth Vargas. And they take these clips that people send in of different crimes and you kind of comment on those as an expert. Well, they always send me the aircraft ones. And the sheer number of those things that I get now, from, just people videoing all the crazy stuff that's happening on planes, it seems to be escalating to a point that I don't know where it's going to stop. And that's what concerns me now. Not so much the safety of the aircraft or the ability of the captain to pilot the ship or whatever. I'm concerned about the people around me and this level of craziness that people are bringing to air travel now. I tell my wife all the time, like, I would rather spend 10 hours on a road trip than 2 hours on an airplane. And a lot of that is because I got 2.4 million miles under my belt as an air marshal and I'm just sick of being in the air. But, a lot of it is because of, that very thing. And I would never want to be on a flight and feel like I have to respond to something, even as a retired Federal Air Marshal, that could have been handled appropriately through good communication skills, which it seems to be is the one big lacking piece anymore that causes people just to kind of snowball and things to escalate out of control.
Yeah. Yeah. That's that's important. But 2.4 million miles in the air. How many times is that around the earth? Have you ever math used the math for that?
I've never done the math, but those are rookie numbers. Those are
Really?
rookie. Yeah, because I was fortunate enough to where I was an air marshal for 19 years. I've got 2.4 million miles. They give you a little sheet when you retire that tells you all your mileage and everything. So I worked in training in Las Vegas, a couple of rotations, which put me out of the air for about a year. I did 3 years in Atlantic City. I did 4 years as a supervisor on the ground in Cleveland, Ohio, before I went back to flying in Philadelphia before I retired. So I've had these little breaks where I wasn't in the air at all. And you've got guys who've been in the air since 2001 and they're still flying. And that's all they've done. And they're creeping up on like 7 million miles, these guys. But, to me, the toll that takes on your body, they didn't want to be in an administrative role. They didn't want to work in training. They had no desire to do anything but fly, and that's fine. But to me, just the toll that takes on your body wasn't worth it. So I wanted to take those little breaks and go to training or go to some administrative position where I could get out of the air for, a year, 2 years, just to kind of recover before I went back to it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Man, that is wild. That is wild. So, Gary, I know that, since we've been talking, people are going to want to know more about you, your books, all the training that you have coming up. Where can people find out more about you online?
well, I've got my website, which is basically the hub for everything, and that's GaryQuessenberry.com. Uh, and then I'm on Facebook and Instagram mostly. That's where I'm most active. But I'm kind of shifting gears a little bit from the training piece. I still do some training courses for, some contract companies and things for executive protection and stuff like that. I've got 4 books out on situational awareness. You might be able to see them behind me over here, but it's
Yeah.
Spotting Danger Before It Spots You, which is a general overview of situational awareness and how it works. And it's nothing written specifically for law enforcement and military. I put everything in simple, easy to understand terms so that everybody can use it. Uh, the second one is Spotting Danger Before It Spots Your Kids, and that's for parents who have children that are between the ages of 4 and 12. And you're trying to get them more engaged with their environment instead of just locked into these devices all the time, and you're teaching them how to spot things that are abnormal that could signal danger and how to communicate those things to an adult. Then there's Spotting Danger for Teens, which is, for teenagers when they start striking out on their own, looking for a little bit of independence, teaching them what to look for and, how those kind of things should be handled. And then the fourth and final book in that series is Spotting Danger for Travelers. And that kind of brings it all together, into a program that you can use whenever you're abroad or whenever you're just going on a family vacation, whether it be in an aircraft or on a road trip. And those 4 books are out now. And I just signed a 3-book contract with YMAA Publications for a fiction series. It's based on a retired Federal Air Marshal who moves back home to Virginia, and
Wow.
stumbles. Yeah, but that's really the only part of it that's kind of realistic, in terms of my life. And then he stumbles upon some things that leads him down this, path of revenge that kind of kind of gets a little exciting. So I'm excited to get that out. The first book in that series is coming out in February of 2025. So we're still working on
Okay.
editing.
Very good, man. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm intrigued by your fiction series here. I think that's gonna be good.
I'll have to get you a copy.
I mean, I appreciate that. Gary, I've had a great time talking to you today. I really do appreciate it. God bless you, man. I appreciate all you're doing.
Hey man, I appreciate what you're doing because without, guys like you getting people on talking about this kind of thing, it's really not something that's in, the front of people's minds. So, thank you for what you're doing and bringing that to light and educating people on what it is they need to understand to keep themselves and their families safe.
Man, I appreciate that. Thank you.